Well, hey CSM, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 24 if you have a Bible with you or want to follow along. And in this series of getting back on track, we've been looking at the life of David. And so to give you a little bit of a catch up if you're just joining in or it's been a couple weeks, basically we have David in 1 Samuel who comes out, he's the shepherd boy. Basically, the first king of Israel, Saul, he ends up betraying God, disobeying God. God removes his spirit. So then God then puts this anointing on David and said, hey, this is going to be my next king. And the more familiar stories you're probably remember is, man, David killed Goliath. And then from there, David went on to serve under Saul, who was still king at that point, but who he was going to take over for. And then he ended up becoming a war veteran. He was somebody who was looked upon by the people. He was praised. And so what happened was Saul started to experience some jealousy that set in. And Saul, in this process of having God's spirit removed from him, ends up starting to become so jealous of David that he gets to the point of trying to kill him. And so David, still serving under King Saul at that time, had this dilemma to go forward with. And today this topic we're going to talk about is living righteously. Because if you look at David's life, especially the early years before he became the king, you see how he had these moments where he had every right, knowing that he was going to be the next king, knowing that he had received the anointing that was taken from Saul and put upon himself to be the king. Like David had the right to the throne, but he lived differently through this time of persecution upon his own life. And we're going to pick up with this story in 1 Samuel 24. And as we do so, we're going to kind of walk our way through it. But as we do, I want to give you 7 tips for how to live righteously. 7 tips that we learned from David that will help us to live righteously within our faith and within our circumstances. So here, let's start with the first one. The first one is this, is that you need to recognize what is your attacker. Who is your attacker? Let's pick up 1 Samuel chapter 24. Let's start in verse 2. And so basically Saul is coming, David's on the run, David's in the wilderness. Basically David went running and then Saul ended up going, just hunting him down. There's this manhunt that's taking place. And so David is fleeing and living in the wilderness and not living as a king like he was anointed to be. He was living as an outcast who was running and fearing for his life. After all of these great things, Saul, here's what we see in verse 2 of chapter 24. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all of Israel, not just your average Joe, war veteran, army man. He picked the elite of the elite, 3,000 people from Israel, and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. And so what happened is David and these men, at this time it was a few hundred men that had come to basically back David and live in the wilderness with him, were out and about. And so Saul gathers this elite troop to track him down. The jealousy and the insecurity and all of the things that had been welling up within Saul's heart were coming to this point of just pure greed to take him out, to take David out, so that there would be no threat to his throne. And I can't help but think and read that where Saul got these 3,000 people together. And I can remember, I'm the oldest of 4 siblings growing up. And so I can remember every time we would go out in public, go to the grocery store, go to the library, whatever it was we used to do. I can always remember my mom packing all these bags for my 4 other siblings. And so I'm the oldest, so I'm the one who's got to carry them. I'm the one who's got to get it together. I'm the one who's got to help buckle them in their car seats. And it's just like at some point I can remember I'm like, Mom, what do we need all this stuff for? There's 3 diaper bags, there's 4 sets of clothes for each kid. I'm like, what is going on? And I can remember her saying this in this idea that saying it's better to be prepared than unprepared. And so you see in this moment where Saul is going to this extreme preparation, 3,000 of the elite troops just to track down David. There's this thing of him trying to be over-prepared for the task he was accomplishing. But David, in this moment, was preparing himself for what he was coming to and up against. David was on the run. He knew his attacker. He knew Saul was coming after him. He knew that there was something wrong in Saul's mind and Saul's heart, if you go back and read in 1 Samuel. And I think in these moments where we look at, hey, what is it that we need to gather? What is it that we need to prepare for as we try to live a righteous life, a life that pursues the purpose and the calling that God puts on our life? It's important for us to recognize who are the ones who are trying to attack us and knock us down. The easy answer we can say is the devil, but what are the things and the tactics that the devil will use to try and stop us, to knock us down, to hinder us from our track? And you have to, here's the question I would have you ask yourself, is what is attacking you? Because many of us falter in our faith. Many of us go through our faith and we're trying to grow, we're trying to read our Bible, we're trying to pray, we're trying to build a community, we're trying to go to church as much as we can. Like we're trying to do all these things, but yet it seems like we keep getting knocked down by the things attacking us. And I don't think we always do a good job of recognizing who the attacker is and how the attacker will attack us. And so it's important to ask ourselves, what is attacking you? What is hunting you? For some of us, it's a struggle of lust. For some of us, it's a struggle of just hate towards somebody. It's a struggle with authority, like we're gonna talk about here in a moment. It's jealousy, it's all these things that are listed. What is the thing that is hindering you? You gotta recognize your attacker. Here's the second thing, is that you have to evaluate your position. So Saul gets this group, this army to pursue David, and here's what he goes on to say in verse 3 and 4. And the second thing is this, is that you gotta evaluate your position. So listen to that and keep that in mind as we read this. At the place where the roads passed some sheepfolds. So there's this crossroads. Saul's traveling with this army. You know, think about when you go on a trip. Here's what he does. Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. I love the way the Bible puts that. Like, you know, sometimes when you go on that journey and, you know, you get to that point where it's like, hey, I got to stop at the rest stop because I had a little too much Mountain Dew on the way here. And so it's time to make a pit stop. Like Saul has this pit stop. He had to go and relieve himself. But as it happened, he walked into a cave and it said David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. So the one Saul was looking for in a moment where he's saying, hey, I'm just going to take care of business, David and his men are crouched back in the dark, and he's in the very cave of the person he's looking for. And so as David and his men are back, this is what they say in verse 4. They tell him, now's your opportunity. David's men whispered to him, today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish. Saying, hey, God has given you this blessing. Your enemy who's hunting you down is right here. He is in your hands to take out. This is the perfect time. He's vulnerable. And so it said David crept forward, and what he did is while Saul was taking care of business, he cut off a piece of his robe. Now think about that. You're in your most vulnerable state, and maybe it's not relieving yourself. Maybe in our life, you know, when are we vulnerable? Because David and Saul, both in their own realms, needed to evaluate their position. Saul probably should have checked the cave when he was out looking for somebody to make sure David wasn't back there before he goes and did what he needed to do. But David also knew that he was in a prime position to make a move, to take care of something and evaluate where he was. And the tables had turned on Saul. You see, David had the upper hand and his men knew this. And this is what's important, and kind of the next question I have to ask you in this is saying, what is your position right now? As we talk about this in a righteous perspective, where are you at righteously? Are you giving in to the things that are attacking you? Are you in a place where you don't have the army beside you that's helping you fight? Are you in a place where you are out in the open, exposed to the attacker? Where are you at in the battles, in the position of your fight? Because God desires that we live righteously, that we pursue Him. And we have to know what our position is. Here's the third thing, is that you got to also sense the Spirit's voice. Sense the Spirit's voice. Let's continue in verse 5. So after David had cut the corner of Saul's cloak off, this is what happened. It says that David's conscience began to bother him because he had cut Saul's robe. Now, why is that significant? You see this moment of saying, hey, Saul is delivered. His men are saying, like, take him out. Like, here's your opportunity. And David goes and cuts the corner and then realizes there's something wrong with inside of his heart and his mind, his conscience. God is beginning to speak to him in this. I have come down many, many mornings to see that my dog, Arthur, he's this big dog, has gotten into the trash and made a mess of things, or we've come home. And here's the thing that almost always happens, is by the time we get home and we see the trash that's sprawled out across our floor and the bread that he ate and all of this thing, I walk in around the corner frustrated, but I look and I can already see him moping there, knowing that he did something wrong, knowing that there was something that he had done that wasn't right. And it's in that same way that God has given us a mind, God has given us a heart to discern what is right and what is wrong. And David in this moment knew, and we're going to look at this here in a second, that he was not king, that God still had Saul on the throne. He knew the promises, he knew the things that God had for him, but Saul was still in command, and it was not his place to take Saul's life at that time. And he had this awareness. Now fast forward to our time into the New Testament. In John chapter 14:26, Jesus said, hey, there's going to be a helper that's going to come, that's going to bring to remembrance the things of the Lord, and that's going to help you walk through and live this life. Jesus was talking to his disciples at that time about the Holy Spirit that would be within them. And just like David, who was anointed, who had the power and the Spirit of God upon him, we also have this. And the question we have to ask ourselves as we walk through life and have that conscience, have God's Spirit kind of challenge us in those moments, is ask this, is what is God speaking to us in that moment? How are we to live righteously in those times where we are questioned, or when we have a situation where we feel off about something? God has given us a mind to think through these things, but he's given us a spirit to discern right and wrong. And so it's those things that maybe God is asking you to do something. You know, we had a great conference and many of you were there over the weekend, but maybe God's stirring something in your heart that's saying, hey, here's the next step for you in your faith. Maybe it's just saying, hey, there is something that's wrong. There's that attack or there's that sin. You're in a bad position. And the Spirit's convicting you and saying, hey, there's something that you need to do, that you need to surrender in order to sense my Spirit. Whatever that is, maybe it's getting involved at church or at school or being somebody who is out and about helping other people experience Christ's love. We have to be open to sensing God's Spirit. Here's the next thing. That other tip for living righteously is that we got to trust God's promises. So let's continue, verse 6. So David said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this to the Lord my king. He's talking about Saul, the man who had thrown spears at him, the man who was hunting him down, the man who had cast him out of the kingdom, the man who had forced him to run in the wilderness and to live in caves. All of this, David's response and the conscience that was stirring up within him was that the Lord forbid that I should do this to the Lord my king, meaning Saul. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. And David came to this recognition that even though he was anointed and chosen to be the next king, that God had not removed Saul from the throne in the place of authority. And he had this realization that even though his men said, hey, now's your opportunity, now's the chance to strike, now's the time to take him out, he knew that was not God's plan, because he trusted and remembered in the promise that God had given him all the way back when he was a young boy, saying that your time will come, that I have chosen you because of your faithfulness and your character. And in that moment, he didn't allow his earthly desires. Let's be real. Put yourself in David's shoes. You're living in a cave. You're away from all of these things. You want to have the comforts of life. You want to be king, and you have every right to the throne. Your human desires would say, I'm going to take that because it's what I deserve. But David was counter to that. He knew the promises God had given him, and he knew the power and the position that God had put Saul in, and he respected the authority of that. He trusted in his promise that even in the middle of wrongdoing and affliction against himself, he understood that God was in control, that God would watch over him, and that God had a plan for him. So here's the question to this point, is what has God said to you? What has God said to you? Because maybe you're saying, hey, God's called me to do this, or maybe God has asked me to start this Bible study at school, or maybe God has asked me to reach out or to be more of an influence amongst my friends. Maybe God has asked you to take a step here at CSM in a way of getting involved in serving. What has God promised you out of that? What has God led you to do? And are you doing it? Or is things not gone as you thought they would? And you're starting to take matters into your own hands, and you're starting to make your own purpose in that. It's important that we sense the Spirit's leading, that we trust in God's promises. But let's go to the next one, because this is what's important. We can know what God promises, but we have to also obey God's command. Verse 6, let's read that again. He said, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to the Lord my king." That God had put Saul in this place, and he knew that the command was, hey, it is not your place, David, to take Saul's life. It is not your place to take out the king of my people. Your time will come. I have promised you this. Now obey and serve as I have commanded. And with all of these things, throughout all these years, it's estimated that David was in the wilderness running for about 15 years of his life. Half of his life at this point. That he knew that it was important to submit and respect the one God had put in authority. I can look back at my life at certain points where there have been people in authority over me. There's been times, we can all talk about our parents and, hey, we don't always agree with them, but they're in that position. But as I got older and got out of the house, there was this time of a position of authority where I was questioning the way that they were leading and thought I could do better personally. And I had this thought of saying, why are they there? I should be doing that. I could do better than that. And in those moments, it's helpful for us to take a step back and understand that God puts people in places and authority over us. Paul talks about this in the New Testament. He says, hey, we're to be like slaves to God in his plan. That if you are somebody who is committed to somebody else, serve them as your master. Serve them in a way that would bring honor to them. And in doing so, it brings honor to your name. And I've had to learn that God puts people in places to help us grow in that time, but also to prepare us for future opportunities. So the question is this, what is God asking you to obey? Maybe it's, for this season of life, it's your parents. You guys are butting heads at this point in time. I remember being a teenager and the restrictions my parents put on me. And I had to come to this understanding and realization that God put them over my life, not to harm me, but to help me. Maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a person of authority. Maybe, we see in our culture a rebuttal against those who are leading our country, leading ourselves. And we're saying, man, I'm not gonna follow them. I could really put a challenge to you that we can disagree with the way that things are done, but God puts people into authority. And it's our job to pray for them, as Scripture talks about. And it's our job to also respect the position that he's put them in. And that we have this opportunity to show God's love when we obey, when we respect, and follow the commands that God gives us. Let's start to wrap up here. The next one is that we have to respect those in authority, like we were just talking about. Let's skip forward a couple verses. So David comes to this point in verse 10, and basically cuts the cloak. He has this conviction from his spirit. He tells his men, no, I'm not taking out Saul. The Lord put him in this place. Here's what happens. Saul runs out of the cave, and David comes after him with that army of 3,000 in the back. And David comes out and shouts and bows down before him. This is what he says. This very day you can see with your own eyes that it isn't true. Because Saul was pursuing him because of lies and because of insecurities that were welled up within his heart. He said, for the Lord placed you at my mercy back there in the cave. Some of my men told me to kill you, but I spared you. For I said, I will never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed one. That David recognized that there was somebody who was in a position of authority over him. And he knew he was to be the next king. He knew he was also anointed by God. He knew that he was going to be the one that God was going to use. But he recognized the person who was in authority over him. And David never let the voices of his men, never let the voices in his own mind take over in his view of Saul. He probably disagreed. He probably was hurt. He probably was tired. He probably was worn out. But he still obeyed the command and respected the authority that God put into play. And he allowed that to guide the way he lived and responded. See, there's a passage in the New Testament that says God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. That even though we deserve things, even though we're probably, able to do more at times than others, God sees the humility of the heart, and that is who God looks for. And it's what he saw in David as a young boy that carried him through as king of Israel. Saul never truly humbled himself. And there's one more passage in Romans 13 that says this: let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. And what Paul is saying in that passage is that God has put people in authority. God has put parents, God has put teachers, God has put bosses, God has put political leaders. God has put people in authority. They might not always be who we agree with. They might not always be who we like, but that they're in there in a place of authority to help grow better. And it's our job to pray for those, to support, and to do what God has asked us to do as people who share his love. So here's the question I have. Who has God put over you? Who are the ones that maybe need respect from you at this time? For some of us, this isn't a big issue. For others of you, this is the biggest issue you're dealing with. You're really struggling with understanding and submitting, and you want to be your own self, and you want to grow, and you want to do those things. And let me tell you, I can remember those days, and I have those times where it's saying, I just want to do what I want. But God has asked us to live a higher calling. He's put a higher purpose upon our hearts. And it's important for us to ask that question of saying, who has God placed over me, over you, and what do I need to do to respect that position? Here's the last one, and we'll wrap up. The last thing is this, is that you have to entrust your life. So David comes out, confronts Saul, and he says, I had the opportunity to kill you, but I didn't, because I will never harm the Lord anointed. And Saul goes on and is crying, oh, David, I've been so wrong to you, and all of this. And here's a response David gives in verse 12. He said, may the Lord judge between us. Perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you are doing to me, but this is what he said about himself, but I will never harm you. David made an oath and a decree to say, hey, judgment is in God's hand. If he sees fit to do that, he will. But I'm not going to take God's position into my own. I'm going to follow and live out the call. I'm going to hold on to the promise he's given me. I'm going to recognize the attacks, but I'm going to live in the way God has asked me to live. And David knew there was nothing he would do to overtake Saul. You see, I want you to point out something if you didn't catch this in the lesson that we talked about. David's lesson is this, is that we got to recognize what's attacking. Follow along with me. We got to recognize the R in that. We have to evaluate our situation. We have to sense what God is trying to say to us. R-E-S. You can start writing these down and follow along. That we have to trust what God has said. That we have to obey what God is asking us to do. Respect those who God has placed over us, and entrust our life fully to him and his plan. R-E-S-T-O-R-E. That we have to restore the purpose and the calling that God has put on our life. That we recognize that in order to live righteously, in order to be blessed upon others, in order to do what God has asked us to do, sometimes we have to restore the areas of our life that are wrong. And we have to ask ourselves these things on a regular basis so that we can live out the calling. You see, you begin the process of restoring your purpose when you fully submit to God and his instruction and plan for your life. So as we do this, and as we wrap up today, here's the challenge and question that I have for you, is what do you need to sacrifice to bring a restoration to your faith? We know that God forgives, we know that God calls, and we know that God has a purpose for our lives, for your life. But sometimes there are the things we have to identify and surrender to God in that. And so what is it that you need to sacrifice to God? Maybe it's an ego. Maybe it's an issue with authority. Maybe it's even just recognizing the issues and the attacks that are coming against you, knowing the position your heart and your mind is, and doing what you need to do to obey God's plan and hold on to his promise. That you would take those things and that you would bring a restoration to your faith so that we can be on track with the purpose and the plan that God has for us. We're praying for you, CSM, and I'm excited to see the things that God's going to do in your life as we walk this calling in the track that God is asking us to walk. What was that, 20 minutes?
That was
25.